Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Saldaña, and this is the National Education Policy Center's Talks Education podcast. In this month's podcast, we spoke with Dr. Matthew Kelly, who's an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership Program in the College of Education at Penn State University. Dr. Kelly is a historian of education and policy analyst who examines the intersections of education funding policies and the inequities of race, ethnicity, income, and residence. In this month's podcast, Dr. Kelly discusses his new book, Dividing the Public, School Finance and the Creation of Structural Inequity. The book uses the history of the district property tax and its alternatives to trace the role of education finance policies in expanding and entrenching structural inequities in education in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, what inspired you to write Dividing the Public?
Thanks for that question. So, I started the project really focusing on post World War II kind of spatial inequality. Found myself moving further and further back in time and was really looking at the role of the state in using schools to support a broader kind of imperial and colonial project. And I found myself focusing on school funding because I kept coming across records and references to a broad state system of funding that existed in California and really went completely against everything that I was being presented about school funding, both within historian historians of education, their writing, but also just popular narratives. And so kind of constant stream of references in newspapers, journal articles when talking about school funding to reference some kind of timeless tradition of localized funding that really erased the hand of the state in funding at all. And that really incongruence between what I was seeing in the records and this broader historical narrative is both what led me to shift the focus of that work onto school funding and really become a school funding scholar and a student of school finance because of it.
You focus on California, and I thought it was great. To see Southgate, where I grew up, mentioned in a historical account of school finance, or Baldwin Park, which is right down the street, right down the freeway, is amazing. It was amazing for me to read through the chapters. So why did you choose California, and how did this shape your research and your findings and the implications when you think the about school finance beyond California?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And California figures really prominently in historical scholarship on post World War II United States as this space where you see the kind of quintessential process of political fragmentation, the proliferation of local governments, and the kind of far reaching patterns of unequal metropolitan development and inequities between cities and suburbs. And so it's a great space because of how important and recognizable it is as a kind of place where historians have been able to locate many of the core themes of the 20th century US developing. And so this is the place where you have a lot of civil rights milestones. This is also the place where you have a lot of civil rights reaction. This is a place that's going to produce both kind of Ronald Reagan as well as a broader shift in political discourse around taxpayer rights, which is inextricably connected to kind of broader resistance to civil rights and is often rooted in a kind of white racial ideology and becomes this thinly veiled way for suburbanites to really try to use a language of property rights to push back against the advancements of the civil rights movement, particularly in California, where you also have the development of Black nationalism. So there's all of these ways in which California becomes this really central space for historians to understand the 20th century after World War II and the nature of inequality and also the broader political dynamics of this period. And in the book, I'm looking at the role of school finance in helping to create that world that's really well known. And I'm going very far back in time, and I'm going kind of all the way back to the 19th century. But even then, even as California is unique in the extent to which it becomes a state right away. It's unique in the extent to which there's a very overt political discourse around the need to bring kind of white families from the East to this space to support the colonization of it by the US amid kind of the gold rush and the gender imbalance of the gold rush. The core underlying dynamic related to settler colonialism and kind of the reproduction of racial hierarchies through schools. It becomes really clear in California, but it again is very much a national story. It's not exceptional to California that you have a broader process of racialized expropriation that's connected to school funding and is at the core of kind of how these spaces become a part of the United States from the very beginning.
So you've mentioned a few times now how there are these themes of colonialism and imperialism that are emerging in your work as you're looking at the historical account of design of both educational policy and public education in the US, but then school finance policy in particular. You spent some time in your work looking at the dispossession of indigenous lands and their reappropriation for elementary and secondary schools. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about what the implications of these findings are for educational historians specifically when they think about school finance. You mentioned some of the contradictions that of what you were finding and what you were hearing, and just what these findings about the dispossession of indigenous lands and the reappropriation means for educational stakeholders more broadly.
That's a great question. And, historians have always mentioned in passing that the Northwest Ordinance has these provisions where the quote unquote public land states that are carved out of the quote unquote public domain will be divided into these townships. And, starting with one section of each township, going on to two, eventually as many as four. Would then be used to support common schools. And it's kind of this aspect of the history that is there, but it's not looked at in a particularly critical way or really thought about in terms of the far-reaching implications it has. And so, one of the things that I point out in the book is how deliberately and explicitly policymakers are talking about the need to use expropriated indigenous land to try to finance common schools in order to then make those lands a recognizable part of the United States by encouraging white families to settle on those lands and essentially, engage in this broader settler colonial project. And it's as explicit can be, absent them using the phrase settler colonialism. But very explicitly, we need to bring white families, the most valuable families, to these spaces. Investing in schools will do that. Creating schools will do that. And the way those schools should be financed is with these expropriated lands. And so there is a really intimate link there between the origins of public education itself in this broader process of expropriation, the creation of racial hierarchy, efforts to extract value from communities of color that I don't think historians have reckoned with in the way that they should. And so one of the things I'm trying to do in my next book project is think a lot more about that. But even states like Massachusetts had a permanent state school fund created in the 1830s in the era of Horace Mann, and that's coming from expropriated land from the Wabanaki Confederacy in Maine. And so there are all of these intimate links that are explicit and they're there in the sources, but that I think historians have not really given sufficient attention to in trying to understand the development of public education over time. And I think for the broader community of education policy scholars, that history is important for us in kind of thinking critically about the broader legal architecture that emerges from it. And the ways in which there are aspects of how we have structured schools and come to think about them, particularly in relation to land and value, in this notion of schools as kind of amenities, things that can be bought and sold with land, that have these roots in this long history of white supremacy and expropriation that I think could and should be central to how we critically look at things that might otherwise be dismissed as neutral and not rooted in this kind of broader colonial history and this broader history of white supremacy.
So I think kind of building on that, you talk quite a bit as well about how there were additional complexities that were created by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and Mexicans who lived uh, on what now is the southwest and west of the United States, that as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo became citizens, um, and how you've mentioned this a bit already, how the systems were designed to maybe address that challenge in educational policy. So I'm wondering if maybe you want to say a little bit more about what you found around the complexities that were added by some of those treaties that happened around in the middle of the 1800s.
Within the California context, there was a guarantee that the property rights of former Mexican nationals who are now U.S. citizens under the terms of this treaty, that those would be honored. And you have white colonials from the East who come into California, and early on, California creates a statewide property tax. Very explicitly to supplement the expropriated indigenous land that would finance schools, while that land, they were saying, while they waited for that land to be surveyed and sold and value extracted from it. And then the process of implementing this tax, the way that land was assessed was in a racially disparate manner, so that when the land was owned by Euro Americans from the East, it would be assessed at a very low rate. And so the tax burden on that land would be very, very low. And then when it was former Mexican nationals, and so U.S. citizens who had their land assessed, it would be assessed at a very, very high rate. And that would then increase the tax burden. And that tax burden would then, of course, be subsidizing the lower burden for Euro Americans, as well as the financing of schools with revenue from that tax. But what also would happen is it would create a situation where you'd be more likely to default and not be able to pay a tax bill, especially if you're a rancher. And there are lots of unethical things that are also happening with a lot of Euro-American attorneys kind of coming in, offering to help, and then taking land in the process of helping work through these things. But then as land, if there is tax delinquency, it would then go to auction, right? And then once it goes to auction, that entire process could really be used to subsidize the further expropriation of land and the accumulation of it by Euro-Americans. And eventually in California, you have kind of political rhetoric around concerns with what gets called land monopolism, because you have so few people, and they're Euro-Americans who came in pretty recent years, who have accumulated such a vast share of all of the lands in California. And it's all through this process of expropriation. And it's all connected to school funding. So schools and how they get financed become really inextricably connected to this broader process of dispossession and the accumulation of land.
I am always careful to ask historians to make connections between the historical accounts that they're writing and present day. But I'm always curious, as you were doing this work and you think about some of the challenges that schools face today and that schools in some ways contribute to, for example, gentrification. Did you find yourself making any connections between the findings around dispossession, around exclusion, intention of policy design, and some of the trends or patterns or issues that we see schools dealing with today?
Yeah, I think in two ways there's some important connections there. And I think one is that the kind of legal mechanisms themselves of tax subsidy and the ways in which there is a kind of broader structure created by the state that is providing subsidies for some at the expense of others, and that's racialized. And I think you can see similar kinds of patterns when you look at how like certain aspects of gentrification have been structured and encouraged by the state, the function of things like tax auctions even, and how all of this is kind of fitting into a broader process of kind of pushing people out of lands where they live, and subsidizing the accumulation of profit by others who then are not good community partners and are not really doing anything to support the broader community that they're coming into. But then also there's a broader kind of connection that I see in, a surprising way that discussion of how a school would attract a white family to make a place seem quote unquote settled, how seamlessly that begins to evolve into, as early as the 1860s, a way of talking about schools as a way to mark a community as desirable, and a way to talk about how the value of living within a community will be increased by the presence of schools. And so this notion that schools are commodities, that they're amenities, but then also that they are can be essentially enclosed, and that you can use them to try to hoard wealth, to try to keep out others. It's very much kind of seamlessly integrated. For example, I talk about real estate advertisements and the way that they talk about schools, and the ways in which early on it's very explicitly about schools as an indicator of colonization, and the ways in which that slowly begins to look a lot like the way folks will talk about schools and kind of elite suburban communities today. And so I think that there are some really clear links there that even as a historian who tends not to be surprised by certain things, would find myself surprised by, in terms of just the resonances there. And so I think that there are a lot of links, and the key pieces, the broader legal kind of mechanisms that are subsidizing and structuring this process in these different eras, and the ways in which that is really connected to the reproduction of racial hierarchies.
So you make a number of, I think, important contributions. One of which being some of this critical work that we're talking around the design of policy and the point at which that started historically. I think the other big contribution is what you started our conversation with, that motivated you, where you heard these contradictions between what you were hearing in the literature, in the historical accounts of school finance and how schools were funded, and what you found. And so I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit more about that, and how there's this myth that schools were funded locally, that it was always the communities that were putting forward the money, and what you found in California.
Yeah. So in California, there's a broader process of localization, where the policies the state is enacting relative to school funding, they're pretty consistently connected to ways of essentially subsidizing the affluence of white elite communities, and really extracting value from underfunding, marginalizing communities of color. But the ways in which that's accomplished shifts over time. And so the state itself really starts out heavily reliant on a state property tax. Over time, it does use some county property taxes. Counties are pretty large in California. And then it does slowly start to devolve funding down to the district level. And so that already kind of goes against the standard narrative, which is that school funding is starting at the local level, and then over time it becomes more and more centralized, because you have an actual kind of process of decentralization. But I think more than that, what has been so illuminating for me in thinking about this broader historical narrative relative to localism, is how present the state always is. And so even when we're talking about the use of local taxes, the ways in which every aspect of the ability for a district to have the status to assess value, to tax certain kinds of wealth, the rate at which they can tax it, the terms on which they can, all of that is structured by the state. And all of these decisions that get made in state capitals are determining every aspect of how that operates. And I think that that's significant, because there's a tendency when we think about inequities relative to localized funding to essentially cast them as de facto, and to really say kind of, no one did it, this is unavoidable, there's not a real deliberate design behind this. And in the process, that really not only conceals the substantive hand of the state in structuring and creating this in all of these really significant ways, but it also really removes culpability from state lawmakers for the things that their policies are doing to essentially children from marginalized communities through the financing policies that they adopt. And so that's one thing that I try to bring out in California. And because of the ways in which it is this process of decentralization to an extent over time, I think it's a nice illustrative case of how heavily the state is involved in every aspect of funding, even when we talk about in this localist manner. But you see the same thing in other states as well. So even in a state where maybe there is a longer tradition of localized funding using a local tax, it's still all of that is rooted in a series of decisions made in a state capital to really kind of go in that direction with how schools would be financed very deliberately. And so I think that's really key. And I start the book talking about San Antonio v. Rodriguez, and as the U.S. Supreme Court is essentially saying that there will not be space for school funding litigation at the federal level because there's not this fundamental right to education under the U.S. Constitution, and that these disparities wouldn't be subject to strict scrutiny. The majority opinion very much replicates this kind of historical narrative about schools developed locally, they started funding locally, then this broad process of industrialization happens, it creates inequality, we've tried our best, what are we going to do? And that's not the case. It's like every step of the way in structuring that process, the state was involved and remains involved, and it is able to evade culpability and responsibility for the consequences of that by acting as if it is just this, de facto result of broad processes of which lawmakers are not responsible.
I want to ask you a follow-up question if there's a chance to relitigate Rodriguez, but I think that's a whole nother podcast. I think you did such a wonderful job. You were talking about how the state played had a hand in the design, and there wasn't just this like situation where people could throw their hands up and, well, too bad, it just happened this way. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, because you did do a wonderful job of this in the book, around the role of experts and expertise, and how experts played a prominent role in informing what the state was doing.
Yeah, there's one of the chapters in the book is about the progressive era, and I'm writing about some figures, particularly at places like Stanford University, who are helping to create the first education schools, education departments in the country. There's a figure at Stanford named Elwood Cubberley. He creates their first department in their school of education. He is often not remembered in as critical of a manner as he should be for a number of different reasons. One of the things that I talk about in the book is how he becomes really involved in the study of school funding, and then becomes really influential within policy context, to the point where lawmakers are even having him kind of write entire committee reports recommending legislation as if they themselves had written it. And so he's highly influential. He really emphasizes the importance of localized funding. So he advocates for the expansion of state responsibility in some contexts, but placing really strict limits on the role of the state so as to not interfere with the place of local governments in school funding. And he's also a historian, and so he's kind of an early historian of education, and he writes a great deal about the role of localized funding and this broader kind of organic development of the U.S. public school. And so even as he's kind of involved in this process of limiting the role of the state of California in school funding, creating justification for it in all of these different ways, he is simultaneously writing these histories that become really influential, that kind of reframe school funding as this originally this localized democratic impulse of which the state did not always have as much responsibility as it does now, and very much is kind of misleading in the historical narrative he creates. He's also eventually going to be a paid lobbyist by some early taxpayer groups, and these taxpayer groups are created and funded by larger corporate entities who are essentially trying to limit their tax rate because it's easier for them to control a state legislature than it is to control the various school districts across the state that would have assessed their properties and then taxed it. And so he's also he's very much implicated in the broader way in which the state itself will come to really minimize the tax burden of large kind of corporate entities, particularly public service corporations, banks, insurance companies in the state. And so there's a lot going on around tax reform about making sure that everyone is ostensibly paying their fair share, including these kind of large entities that have intangible forms of wealth that seem to be evading the tax assessor. And he'll be kind of critical for a group of experts who will come in to say, well, these groups can't pay any more than they already have. They're, like, this is as good as it can get. You have to really lower your taxes. Like, this is all that we can do to produce revenue.
You also talked quite a bit about how there was this state level discourse that was happening and how that seeped into how local communities were thinking about public schools. So I'm wondering if maybe you want to say a little bit about that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in the 19th century, the way in which both federal and state policy is framing and discussing school funding and the purposes of creating schools and financing them around this kind of broader colonial project of the need to invest in schools so as to attract white families then increasing the value of land, creating all of these opportunities and spaces where again and again and again, as people, even as they disagree about small kind of technical details, reiterate this broader framework that's associating school funding with the expropriation of land, with the creation of value that's racialized, really kind of linking whiteness itself with the value of property, linking schools with the notion that they commodify the land around them by virtue of being kind of connected to and indicators of white families residing in spaces that have long been homes to indigenous people and part of northern Mexico, and so long been home to Mexican nationals. And all of that kind of broader policy discourse that's getting repeated is very much, I think, giving additional space to its repetition at the local level as well. And so I think that, it's certainly not the case that a lot of these associations between kind of race and value in schools, there's certainly an appetite for that at the local level, particularly as you have kind of like really racist policymakers at the local level. But certainly the state itself, through these federal and state policy, creating all of these opportunities for these broader narratives to get repeated, and then really kind of setting the terms upon which these smaller local level policy decisions have to get made within a framework that's assuming, expropriated land belongs to the white, migrants who arrived in an area, and they have to decide exactly how they want to manage that fund. But it is their right to have it. And that's a kind of structured within the policy itself. And that's how a lot of these conversations are unfolding. And so I see a lot of kind of those state level policies creating a broader structure where the narrative around it, as policy decisions at the local level unfold, really reiterate these kind of broader, deeply problematic associations.
So we've reached the point of recommendations, and I have two final questions for you. One is, what lessons do you hope people take from your book? And the second is, where can people find it?
So I'll start with where that one's really easy, right? Where the book will be released on January 15th, and so it can be found at any standard kind of bookseller. And then also I would just emphasize that the ebook, through a grant, the generosity of my university and Cornell University Press, will be open access. And so for folks who don't have the means to purchase a book, it will still be fully accessible, which in my mind, that feels appropriate given the broader substance and focus of the book. And so it'll be available, completely online, the ebook version, on January 15th. And then, of course, you can also order it through Bookshop or Cornell University Press's webpage, or any other kind of place where you typically purchase books. In terms of the lessons, I think that, one of the things that I'm often talking about throughout the book when I'm talking about these broader ways in which the state is using school finance to encourage and structure and reproduce broader patterns of racial hierarchy and promote segregation, subsidize white affluence. A lot of the policies I'm talking about will seem potentially kind of technical and neutral without a really critical engagement with them, because they are the kinds of policies historians have often overlooked, but are very much racialized and connected to inequality. And so policies around things like, whether it's tax assessment or the powers that are granted to local governments to control land use and home rule provisions, and all of these things that don't seem to be as connected as we might initially imagine to the state's hand in creating unequal places over time. And so for me, I think the lesson becomes looking carefully at contemporary policies that are being passed, particularly in state legislatures, and examining the extent to which they are potentially also implicated in the reproduction of inequality and furthering a broader tendency for most states to really condition the amount of funding that a school district receives on the race and class of the child being educated. And I think it's just important to look really carefully and critically at that broader policy architecture. And it is revisited with each budget cycle. So lawmakers are, whether it's that they're continuing to uphold a previously passed law or they're passing a new one, they're very much engaged in this process on a regular basis with each state budget of either reifying and continuing to uphold certain policies or potentially upending them. And so I think that's in part, in my mind, a big lesson from this is policies that we might not always give as much critical scrutiny to, that maybe we really ought to, and that in doing so, it might be a path to better promote a more just kind of education system for students. And I often ask people if they know who both of their representatives are in their state legislature. And folks often cannot answer, even when they're very, very politically engaged. And so I think that there's an element of that as well, as particularly looking at your state legislature, your state representatives, what is happening with those state policies. As educational researchers, we tend to privilege, generalizability. We often want to talk about, federal policies or some kind of pattern that's not exclusive to an individual state. But I think it's important for researchers as well to really focus on what's happening with the policies of individual states, so as to, I think, help guide that critical scrutiny and assist folks in taking a look.
Thank you again, Dr. Kelly, for being on this month's podcast. As always, we hope you're safe and healthy. And remember, for the latest analysis on education policy, you should subscribe to the NEPC newsletter at nepc.colorado.edu.